I had always lived a comfortable life. I had a stable job that paid well, a house in a quiet neighborhood, and a family I loved dearly. But one fateful day, everything changed. The company I worked for had been restructuring, and I was one of the employees let go in the process. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never thought that something like this could happen to me. I was good at my job, loyal to the company, and I had no warning that my entire life was about to shift in such a dramatic way. The shock of the layoff didn't just leave me unemployed, it also shattered my sense of security. I found myself questioning everything, my worth, my identity, and what my future would look like without this part of my life. It felt as if the rug had been pulled out from under me, and all my plans had crumbled. My world, which once seemed so stable, now felt incredibly fragile. As I faced the harsh reality of joblessness, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been too complacent, too comfortable. The uncertainty ahead was terrifying, and I felt like I had lost not just a job but also my place in the world. Losing my job was a blow, but it wasn't the only hardship that came crashing down. My marriage, which had always been a cornerstone of my life, began to unravel. The stress of losing my income created tension between my spouse and me. Arguments became frequent, and the love that once seemed unshakable started to feel distant. We tried counseling, but the weight of our issues was more than we could bear. Eventually, we separated. It felt like I had lost everything: my career, my partner, and my sense of direction. The pain of that loss was something I hadn't anticipated. Divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage, it felt like the end of a chapter in my life, a chapter one had believed would last forever. The empty space in my home was a constant reminder of what I had lost. I spent nights questioning if I could ever rebuild the life I had before. Would I ever find happiness again? The road ahead seemed incredibly lonely, and I had no idea how to navigate this new, painful reality. It was a time of deep despair, but it was also the beginning of a journey I couldn't yet understand. With the loss of my job and marriage, I was left to deal with mounting financial struggles. The bills didn't stop coming just because I was out of work. Credit card payments, rent, utilities, all of it piled up. Each letter from a creditor seemed like a reminder of how far I had fallen. I had always been responsible with money, but now I was juggling bills and debts I couldn't keep up with. I was scared. The idea of losing my home, my car, and the basic comforts I had taken for granted haunted me. I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to make it work. I applied for jobs, but the opportunities seemed few and far between. The pressure weighed on me heavily, and every rejection added to the growing sense of hopelessness. It was during this time that I felt an overwhelming sense of failure. I had once been someone who had it all together, and now I couldn't even manage to pay my bills. The financial strain put even more distance between me and the people I loved. I became withdrawn, embarrassed by my situation, and desperate for a way out. But despite my efforts, things seemed to keep spiraling downward. The financial struggles were draining, but the emotional toll was even more profound. I felt as if I had lost my sense of self. Who was I now? Without my job, my marriage, or my financial security, I felt like a shadow of the person I had been. I spent most days in a fog, barely able to summon the energy to do even the simplest tasks. My confidence had shattered, and I found myself sinking into a depression I couldn't escape. The weight of failure and hopelessness was suffocating, and I couldn't see a way out. It wasn't just the external losses that hurt, it was the internal battle I was fighting. I no longer recognized myself. The dreams I once had seemed distant and unattainable. I struggled to get out of bed each morning, and even the smallest tasks felt overwhelming. The emotional toll was isolating. I was ashamed to talk about my struggles with anyone, afraid they would judge me for what I had become. I kept it all inside, hoping the storm would pass. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, making it difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was lost, but I didn't know how to find my way back. As the days stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being abandoned. I had always been someone who believed in the power of family and friends. But now, it seemed as though everyone had moved on with their lives, and I was left behind. My friends didn't know what to say to me, and my family didn't know how to help. I began to feel like a burden to those around me, and the loneliness grew deeper with each passing day. I withdrew further, unwilling to let anyone see how much I was hurting. This sense of abandonment wasn't just from others, it was internal as well. I felt abandoned by God. How could He allow this to happen to me? I had always been a person of faith, but now I found myself questioning everything I had ever believed. My prayers felt unanswered, my cries unheard. It seemed as though the harder I tried to hold onto my faith, the more distant God became. I was lost in my pain, and it felt like I was walking through life without any real direction. I wanted to believe that there was a purpose behind all of this, but the darkness made it hard to see. It was in this void that I realized I needed something more than just my own strength to get through. It was during one of my darkest nights that I turned to God in a way I never had before. Desperate for guidance, I fell to my knees and prayed with every ounce of my being. I poured out my pain, my confusion, and my doubts. I asked for clarity, for direction, and for peace. I had tried everything else, but nothing seemed to work. I realized that all the material things I had relied on, the job, the marriage, the financial security, were fleeting, and they had failed me when I needed them most. What I needed was something deeper, something that would sustain me through the hardest times. As I prayed, something shifted inside me. I began to feel a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't an answer to my problems, but it was the assurance that I wasn't alone in my struggle. It was as if God was reminding me that He was still there, even when everything else had fallen apart. I didn't understand why things were happening the way they were, but in that moment, I realized I didn't need to understand. I just needed to trust. Trust that God had a plan for me, even if I couldn't see it yet. This was the first step toward healing, and though I didn't know it then, it would change everything. As I began to lean more into my faith, I also discovered a strength within myself that I had never known existed. Before, I had relied on external factors, my job, my relationships, my financial stability, to give me a sense of self-worth. But with all of that gone, I was forced to confront myself. I realized that the strength I had been searching for was already inside of me. It wasn't something I could find in a paycheck or in the approval of others. It was something that came from within. This newfound strength wasn't instantaneous. It took time for me to rebuild my confidence and belief in my own abilities. Each day was a small victory, and I began to take pride in my resilience. I had been knocked down, but I was getting back up, stronger than before. It was in this process of rebuilding myself that I found my true identity, not in the roles I had played before, but in the person I was becoming. I realized that I wasn't defined by my losses, but by my ability to keep going, no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed. As I continued on my journey, I began to understand the importance of letting go. I had held on so tightly to the things I had lost, the career, the marriage, the security, that I had become trapped in my own grief. It was as if I was clinging to these memories, afraid to let them go because doing so would mean accepting the reality of change. But I slowly came to understand that letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing myself from the pain that came with holding on too tightly. Letting go wasn't easy. It required me to release the anger, resentment, and sadness that I had been carrying. It meant forgiving myself for the mistakes I had made and allowing myself the grace to heal. As I learned to let go, I felt lighter. The weight of my past began to lift, and I made space for new possibilities. I realized that by holding on to the past, I was blocking the blessings that were waiting for me in the future. Letting go was the first step toward embracing the new life that God had planned for me. In the midst of my struggle, I began to realize that there was purpose in my pain. It wasn't something I could see right away, but as I looked back on the hardships I had faced, I saw how they had shaped me. The pain I had experienced had taught me resilience, compassion, and the ability to persevere. It had stripped away the superficial aspects of life, leaving only what truly mattered: my faith, my strength, and my capacity for love and forgiveness. I began to see my struggles not as a curse, but as a catalyst for personal growth. The difficulties I had faced were not there to destroy me, but to prepare me for something greater. I learned that the most painful seasons of life often bring the most profound lessons. In the years to come, I would look back on this time as a turning point, the moment when I discovered a new sense of purpose and meaning in my life. The journey wasn't easy, but it was through the pain that I found my true calling. Through all of my struggles, I began to shift my perspective on loss. At first, I saw it as something devastating, something that left an irreparable hole in my life. But as I healed, I came to realize that loss is not the end. It is a part of the cycle of life, a necessary experience that can lead to growth. Loss taught me to appreciate the things I had once taken for granted and to be open to new opportunities that may come my way. Instead of viewing loss as a negative experience, I started to see it as an opportunity for renewal. I understood that sometimes, in order to gain something greater, we must first release what no longer serves us. I became more comfortable with the idea that life is full of change, and each change brings the potential for new blessings. The loss of my job and marriage, while painful, had opened up space for something better, something I couldn't yet see but was learning to trust in. As I worked on rebuilding my life, I also began to focus on rebuilding my relationships. I realized that the isolation I had felt during my struggles was partially self-imposed. I had pushed people away out of shame and fear of being judged. But as I healed, I began to reach out to those I had distanced myself from. I sought forgiveness for the times I had withdrawn and allowed the walls I had built to come down. Rebuilding relationships wasn't just about reconciling with others. It was also about mending my relationship with myself. I had to learn to accept and love myself again before I could truly connect with others. Slowly, I started to rebuild the bonds I had lost. Friends who had once drifted away came back into my life, and new friendships were formed. I learned that true connection comes from vulnerability and openness. By allowing myself to be authentic and honest with others, I created stronger, more meaningful relationships. During this journey, I began to practice gratitude in a way I never had before. When everything felt bleak, I forced myself to look for the small blessings in my life. I started keeping a gratitude journal, writing down one thing I was thankful for every day. Some days, it was the warmth of the sun or the kindness of a stranger. Other days, it was simply the fact that I had made it through another day. Over time, this practice shifted my mindset. I realized that, despite all my losses, I still had much to be grateful for. Gratitude didn't just change my perspective, it changed the way I approached life. It helped me to focus on what I had, rather than what I had lost. By shifting my focus, I began to see opportunities and blessings that I had overlooked before. Gratitude opened my eyes to the richness of my life, even in the midst of hardship. I learned that no matter how difficult things may seem, there is always something to be thankful for. This mindset has stayed with me, and it continues to shape the way I navigate life's challenges. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn during this time was trusting God's timing. I wanted immediate answers. I wanted my life to be fixed right away, to have everything back in place. But the more I tried to force things to happen on my own, the more I found myself frustrated. It was only when I surrendered my need for control that I began to experience peace. I realized that God's plan for me was unfolding at its own pace, and that I didn't need to rush it. Trusting God's timing wasn't easy, especially when I didn't understand the reasons behind my struggles. But as I reflected on my journey, I could see how each step, each challenge, had brought me closer to the person I was meant to be. I began to trust that the right opportunities would come when the time was right, and that I didn't need to force anything. Learning to let go of my need for control allowed me to find peace in the uncertainty and trust that everything would fall into place according to a divine plan. As I let go of the material pursuits that had once defined me, I began to rediscover the joy of simplicity. Before my life fell apart, I was always chasing after the next big thing: new gadgets, promotions, and a life of convenience. But now, with fewer possessions and no luxury to rely on, I started to see the beauty in the little things. A walk in the park, a home-cooked meal, the sound of laughter shared with loved ones. It was as if my soul was being restored, finding contentment in things I had once overlooked. This simple life was not devoid of challenges, but it was peaceful in a way that I had never experienced. I found comfort in nature's rhythms, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the act of nurturing my relationships without distractions. I learned that true wealth is not measured by material possessions, but by the richness of experiences and connections. Through this journey, I discovered that happiness doesn't come from accumulation, but from appreciating the small, everyday blessings that make life truly meaningful. As my life began to shift, my faith grew deeper. Before the upheaval, I had relied on my own strength, thinking I could handle anything that came my way. But the challenges I faced proved otherwise. It was in my darkest moments that I turned to God, desperate for guidance and comfort. What I found was a profound sense of peace, a connection that transcended my circumstances. I realized that faith wasn't just about asking for blessings, it was about trusting that God would carry me through whatever came next. This renewed sense of faith transformed my outlook on life. No longer did I feel like I was walking alone through the wilderness of my struggles. I had the assurance that God had a purpose for my pain and that everything was happening according to His plan. I learned to surrender my fears and trust in a higher purpose, understanding that the path ahead, though uncertain, was guided by divine hands. My faith became my anchor, keeping me steady as I faced the storms of life. One of the most daunting aspects of losing everything was the loss of my career. My job had been the cornerstone of my identity. But as the days passed, I realized that this was an opportunity to rebuild, not just my career, but my entire sense of purpose. I began to explore new paths, looking for ways to align my work with my newfound values. I sought out opportunities that would allow me to contribute to others, to make a difference, rather than just chasing after success for its own sake. Rebuilding my career didn't happen overnight. It took time to find the right fit and to build the skills I needed to succeed in a new field. But with God's guidance and a deep sense of purpose, I found myself in a position where I was not only doing work I loved, but also work that helped others. The financial security I had once taken for granted was no longer my primary concern. I found joy in doing meaningful work, and through this process, I learned that purpose far outweighs prestige or income. My career became more than just a job. It became a calling. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was the power of forgiveness. I had been hurt deeply by people who I thought would always be there for me. I held on to that pain for so long, thinking it would somehow give me power over the situation. But as time passed, I realized that the only person I was hurting was myself. The bitterness and anger I carried with me were weighing me down, keeping me stuck in the past. It wasn't until I chose to forgive, both myself and others, that I truly began to heal. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what had happened, nor did it mean excusing the hurt. It simply meant releasing the hold that pain had on me. As I forgave, I felt a weight lift from my heart, and a peace settled in its place. I learned that forgiveness is not a one-time event but a continuous process. It was something I needed to practice daily, but each time I forgave, I felt a little freer. I also realized that God's grace for me was a model for how I should extend grace to others. Forgiveness became a tool for my healing and a way to move forward. In my most difficult moments, I discovered the true power of prayer. At first, prayer had felt like a ritual, something I did when I needed something or when I was grateful. But as my struggles deepened, I turned to prayer for comfort and guidance. I realized that prayer wasn't just about asking for help. It was a way to connect with God on a deeper level. Each prayer became a conversation, an exchange where I not only asked for strength but also listened for God's whispers of direction and peace. Through prayer, I found clarity. It gave me the courage to take steps I never thought I could, and the peace to accept things I couldn't change. Prayer became my daily refuge, a sacred space where I could be vulnerable and honest with God. I learned that God was always listening, even in my silence. Through prayer, I began to understand that I wasn't alone. God's presence became a constant in my life, reminding me that He was always near, ready to guide me through every challenge. As the days turned into months, I realized that my life was now a blank canvas, and I had the chance to paint a new picture. The losses I had experienced were not the end, but rather a necessary step towards something greater. I began to look forward to the future with hope, instead of dwelling on the past with regret. Each new beginning felt like a fresh opportunity, a chance to learn, to grow, and to become the person God had always intended for me to be. This new chapter was filled with uncertainty, but I no longer feared it. I had learned to trust the process, to understand that change is often necessary for growth. Each new beginning came with its own set of challenges, but I embraced them with faith and courage. I knew that God was with me, and that with every step forward, I was being guided toward a life that was richer and more fulfilling than I had ever imagined. Looking back on everything I had lost and everything I had gained, I saw that my life had been completely transformed. The person I was before the hardships seemed so far removed from the person I had become. I had gone through the fire, and though I was scarred, I was stronger. I had learned to live with purpose, to embrace the lessons that came from pain, and to trust in God's plan for my life. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without difficulty, but it was real. Today, I stand in a place of peace, surrounded by the people and blessings that I once thought were beyond my reach. I am no longer defined by what I lost, but by the strength and wisdom I gained from it. My story is one of redemption and renewal, of learning to trust and to surrender. God gave me more than I ever dreamed of, not in material wealth, but in love, peace, purpose, and the ability to impact others. Through the trials, I found my true calling, and I am forever grateful. In the early days of my journey, patience was a lesson I had to learn the hard way. Everything in my life felt like it was moving too slowly, like progress was always just out of reach. I wanted immediate answers, quick solutions, and a fast return to the life I once had. But God, in His wisdom, taught me that some things take time to heal, and true growth doesn't happen overnight. The process was slow, but with each passing day, I began to see the importance of waiting and trusting in His timing. As time passed, I learned that patience was not just about waiting for things to get better. It was about trusting God in the midst of the struggle, knowing that He was at work even when I couldn't see it. I started to understand that the lessons I was learning during the waiting period were just as valuable as the rewards that would come later. Patience became a virtue I carried with me, not just in times of hardship, but in every area of my life. I learned to appreciate the journey, even when it seemed like I wasn't moving forward. One of the greatest gifts I received after losing everything was the support of the community around me. In my darkest moments, when I felt isolated and alone, it was the people in my life who reached out to lift me up. Whether it was a friend offering a listening ear, a stranger providing a helping hand, or a church community offering prayer, I realized that no one truly has to walk through life's challenges alone. God had placed the right people in my life at the right time, and through their support, I found strength I didn't know I had. The power of community wasn't just about receiving help, it was also about giving it. As I healed and grew stronger, I began to give back in the ways that I could, whether through volunteering, offering encouragement, or simply being there for someone else in need. The act of giving strengthened my faith, as I saw how God used my experiences to help others. I came to understand that we are all connected, and that through serving one another, we fulfill God's purpose for our lives. The love and support of my community became a foundation on which I could rebuild my life. Gratitude became a transformative force in my life. In the midst of loss, it was easy to focus on what I no longer had, to dwell on the things I had once taken for granted. But as I walked through the pain, I began to shift my perspective. I started to notice the small blessings that had once been hidden in the chaos. Sunrises, a smile from a stranger, the warmth of a good meal, and the quiet comfort of a home that was now filled with peace. I realized that no matter what I had lost, there was always something to be thankful for. Living with gratitude didn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending everything was perfect. It meant acknowledging the good amidst the struggle, recognizing that God was still working in my life, even when things were tough. Gratitude helped me find contentment in what I had, instead of longing for what I had lost. It taught me to focus on the present moment, to appreciate the journey, and to trust that God was with me every step of the way. The more I embraced gratitude, the more my heart opened to the beauty of life, even in its imperfections. Fear and doubt had always been my companions, especially during the darkest moments of my life. I feared the unknown, worried about the future, and questioned whether I would ever be able to rebuild. Every setback seemed like a sign that I wasn't capable of moving forward. But in time, I realized that fear and doubt were merely obstacles on the path to faith. I began to see them not as signs of weakness, but as opportunities to trust God more deeply. With each step I took in faith, I noticed that my fears began to diminish. I learned that faith isn't the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it. As I faced my doubts and chose to trust God, I saw His provision in ways I never expected. The more I surrendered my fears to Him, the more I was able to experience His peace. I came to understand that God had not given me a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. By overcoming my fears, I discovered a strength within me that I hadn't known existed. The loss of everything I had once held dear forced me to take a long, hard look at my life and reevaluate what truly mattered. I had spent so much of my time chasing after success, wealth, and status, thinking that these were the things that would bring me happiness. But when I lost it all, I realized that these things were fleeting. What mattered most were the relationships I had, the love I shared with others, and the faith that grounded me. The pursuit of success seemed shallow compared to the depth of these intangible treasures. As I shifted my priorities, I found a new sense of fulfillment. I began to invest more time in the people I loved, in nurturing relationships, and in deepening my faith. I realized that the things that truly brought joy into my life were the ones that couldn't be bought or earned. They were gifts from God. By letting go of my obsession with achievement, I found a peace that was far more satisfying than any career success or material possession could ever provide. I learned that true success is not measured by what you have, but by who you are and how you love. At first, I couldn't understand why I had to endure such deep pain and loss. It felt unjust, like life had dealt me a cruel hand. But as time went on, I began to see that my pain had a purpose. I found that God uses our struggles to shape us, to refine us, and to prepare us for something greater. The pain I had endured wasn't in vain. It had led me to a deeper understanding of myself, of others, and of the world. Through it, I found my true purpose. I realized that my pain had made me more compassionate, more understanding, and more equipped to help others who were suffering. The experiences I had gone through allowed me to connect with people on a deeper level, offering them hope and encouragement in their own struggles. My pain had become a catalyst for growth, not just for me, but for those around me. I came to understand that God doesn't waste our suffering. He uses it to bring about something beautiful. Through my pain, I found a purpose that was greater than anything I could have imagined. As I began to rebuild my life, I found that one of the greatest sources of joy came from giving to others. In my earlier years, I had been focused on accumulating wealth, possessions, and success, but now I discovered the true richness that came from sharing. Whether it was through offering a meal to someone in need, sharing my time with those who were lonely, or simply lending a hand in a moment of crisis, I realized that giving was far more fulfilling than receiving. It was through giving that I began to truly understand God's love. Each time I gave, I found that my heart grew in ways I never expected. I didn't always have much to give, but the act of offering what I had, whether it was material possessions, time, or even encouragement, filled me with a sense of purpose and fulfillment. Giving became a way to reflect God's love and generosity. I learned that when we give from a place of humility and love, we receive far more than we give. Through this, I discovered the kind of joy that only comes from selfless giving, a joy that money or status could never provide. The road to rebuilding my life wasn't easy. There were days when it felt like progress was too slow, and the mountain ahead of me was too steep to climb. But I realized that the key to overcoming was not in rushing the process but in taking one step at a time. God had shown me that even the smallest steps toward healing and growth were significant. When I looked back at the journey, I could see how far I had come, even though the individual steps seemed small. As I continued to take each step, I started to gain momentum. The fear of the unknown began to dissipate as I realized that I didn't have to have it all figured out at once. God was guiding me, and as long as I remained faithful and kept moving forward, He would provide the strength I needed. By breaking down the journey into manageable pieces, I was able to make progress every day, no matter how small. Rebuilding my life became less about trying to restore everything at once and more about trusting in the process, step by step. There were times when I didn't think I could go on. The weight of my loss, the fear of failure, and the doubts in my heart were almost overwhelming. But in those moments of despair, I began to tap into a strength that I hadn't known I possessed. It was as if God was stirring something deep within me, giving me the courage to press on, even when I felt like giving up. Slowly, I began to realize that I wasn't as weak as I thought I was. With each challenge I overcame, my confidence grew, and I discovered a resilience I never knew I had. I learned to trust in my abilities and in God's provision. It wasn't about being invincible or perfect. It was about knowing that, with God's strength, I could face anything. As I looked back at all the struggles I had faced, I realized that each one had been an opportunity to build my inner strength. The hardships had shaped me into someone stronger and more capable than I had ever imagined. Before I lost everything, I had a very narrow view of success. I equated success with wealth, status, and the approval of others. But after going through the pain of losing everything, I gained a new perspective on what true success looked like. I realized that success wasn't about material gain or recognition. It was about living a life of purpose, serving others, and being faithful to what God had called me to do. Success became less about achieving my own goals and more about fulfilling God's purpose for my life. This shift in perspective was liberating. I no longer felt the pressure to conform to society's expectations or to measure my worth by external standards. Instead, I found fulfillment in knowing that I was following God's plan for my life, even when it didn't align with the world's definition of success. I began to see success in the relationships I built, the love I shared, and the impact I had on others. True success, I learned, is not about what you have, but about who you are and the difference you make in the world. Losing everything tested my faith in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, I questioned God's plan, wondering why I had to go through such painful trials. But in the midst of my despair, I started to rediscover the depth of my faith. I found comfort in Scripture, peace in prayer, and strength in knowing that God was with me, even when I couldn't see it. My faith was no longer based on circumstances, but on the unshakable truth that God is always faithful, no matter what we face. As my faith grew, I began to understand that it wasn't about having all the answers or understanding everything that happened in my life. It was about trusting in God's character and His love for me. I learned to rely on Him not just in the good times, but especially in the hard times. Rediscovering my faith was like finding a solid foundation beneath my feet, something that couldn't be shaken by the storms of life. It became the anchor that held me steady as I navigated through the challenges ahead. Through the process of losing everything and starting over, I learned the value of humility. Before, I had been proud of my accomplishments, my possessions, and my perceived self-sufficiency. But when everything was stripped away, I was left with nothing but the grace of God. I came to understand that true strength comes not from self-sufficiency but from recognizing that we are completely dependent on God. Humility allowed me to see my own limitations and to rely on God's strength rather than my own. Humility also opened my heart to others in a way I hadn't experienced before. I became more compassionate, more understanding of others' struggles, and more willing to serve without expecting anything in return. I realized that in our weakness, God's strength is made perfect. Through my own journey of humility, I saw how God uses our lowly moments to raise us up, not for our own glory, but for His. Humility became a cornerstone of my life, teaching me to approach others with love and grace, just as God had shown me. The process of healing wasn't just about restoring my external circumstances, it was about healing from the inside out. The emotional wounds I had carried for so long needed to be addressed before I could fully rebuild. I started by allowing myself to feel the pain, to grieve the losses, and to confront the emotions that I had been avoiding. It was a painful process, but it was also necessary. God showed me that healing requires vulnerability and a willingness to face the things that hurt. As I embraced the healing process, I began to notice changes in my heart. The bitterness and resentment I had carried slowly began to fade, replaced by peace and forgiveness. I learned that true healing isn't a quick fix, it's a journey that requires patience, faith, and trust in God's timing. As I allowed God to work in my heart, I found that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past, it was about becoming the person He had always intended me to be. Through His grace, I was healed from the inside out, and my life was transformed. In the darkest moments of my journey, prayer became my lifeline. When everything around me felt uncertain, I would retreat into prayer, pouring out my heart to God. There were times when words failed me, and I simply sat in silence, trusting that God knew my pain even when I couldn't express it. It was during these quiet moments that I felt His presence most strongly. I began to understand that prayer wasn't about asking for things, but about building a relationship with God, one rooted in trust and communication. As I continued to pray, I noticed a shift in my heart. I no longer prayed with the expectation of instant answers or solutions. Instead, I prayed for guidance, for peace, and for strength. Prayer became a way for me to align my will with God's, to ask for His wisdom and direction. Over time, I came to see how God was answering my prayers in ways I hadn't imagined. The power of prayer wasn't in the words I said, but in the connection it created between me and God, reminding me that I was never truly alone. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was to trust in God's timing. There were so many times when I felt like I had waited long enough and that it was time for things to turn around. I grew impatient, wanting my life to get back on track immediately. But I slowly began to realize that God's timing was perfect. What seemed like a delay was often an opportunity for growth or a chance to prepare for something better. I learned that when I tried to force things to happen on my own, it only led to frustration and disappointment. Trusting God's timing didn't mean sitting back and doing nothing. It meant remaining faithful, working toward my goals, and letting God lead me. I had to learn to surrender control and trust that He knew what was best for me. Eventually, I saw how God's timing had worked in my favor, bringing people, opportunities, and blessings into my life at exactly the right moment. I realized that when we trust God's timing, we can be at peace knowing that He is working all things together for our good, even when we can't see it right away. One of the most freeing experiences of my life came when I learned to let go. I had spent so much time clinging to what I had lost, whether it was my possessions, relationships, or dreams. Letting go didn't mean forgetting or giving up on everything I had hoped for, but it meant releasing the grip I had on my own plans. I learned that I couldn't control everything, and sometimes, holding on too tightly only caused more pain. In letting go, I made room for God to step in and do what I couldn't do on my own. Letting go also allowed me to heal from the past. I had been holding on to bitterness, regrets, and hurts that were keeping me stuck. But once I surrendered them to God, I found peace. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing others or minimizing the pain I had felt. It was about releasing myself from the burden of carrying it. Letting go became an act of faith, trusting that God would take care of the things I couldn't change and that He would bring new blessings into my life in His time.